Tai sveiki atėję į antrą salę.
Good morning. Welcome to the hall number 2. I will speak a little so that people who still are having snacks would see that something's happening in the audience and would come into this hall. Yes, good afternoon. Come in. We are about to have a very specific debate, but first of all, as far as I understood, we first of all have to discuss the term itself, which we are going to talk about, and maybe we'll find some new ways of cooperation between the industry and the agriculture. Carbon sequestration or carbon farming, that is the topic today. And our goal today is to understand of how that carbon farming works in the market and to look for new ways, new solutions of how to make that carbon farming in practice work. And there are numerous debates on how it may look in practice. There are various initiatives and projects intended for this purpose. As for risks, I understand that transparency is a great issue here. Certain schemes are possible to, evade or go around the system. So that is important to learn about it, to educate the farmers, and to discuss just simply what that carbon farming is. My name is Živilė Kropaitė. I will introduce all the speakers, the panelists. Next to me, the only person who represents industry, that is Vidmantas Janulevičius, the president of Lithuanian Industrialists Confederation. We also have the Arnas Radzevičius, who is of the agricultural company Agrokoncernas, the head of the Precise Technology Department. We also have Remigijus Lapinskas, who is the director of the Green Policy Institute. We also have Raimundas Juknevičius, the chairman of Lithuanian Farmers Union, and Donatas Dailidė, who is the general manager of Dojus Group. So we don't have a QR code here, but if you visited the slido.lt, and if you enter the hashtag Agri 2022, you can ask any question anytime in the run of this entire hour that we'll have our debate. Agri is just like the title of this forum, and 2022 and S2, that is the whole number 2. So maybe that doesn't sound very simple, but that's all you need to know. This code, the hashtag, and I have my tablet here where I will be able to see all of your questions. You will also have a chance to ask questions here live, but please be active and please ask as many questions as possible so that we could turn this conversation as instrumental as possible and that you can get as many benefits as possible from this talk. We'll have an insight from the first foreign speaker, that is Alejandro Trenor from Soil Capital, but unfortunately, due to unpredicted circumstances, he is not able to take part in this debate. So we'll have a rather Lithuanian type of debate, and we'll talk about these carbon credits and that carbon farming. Can we say that carbon farming is something new in Lithuania and that we haven't started it yet? And just can you, Mr. Lapinskas, explain what that is in general? I will try to define this concept. I will give you a little of theory. And, Vidmantas is the only one who represents industry. Me, personally, I don't like, those so-called empty talks. So I'd like to test everything myself. As for carbon farming, for cutting the amount of carbon, I have tested several options myself, and I will share my experiences in how I did that. Investments into alternative protein, let's say, from insects and etc., organizing farmers market. And in general, when we refer to carbon market, we have the green policy of the EU, which aims to cut carbon emissions by 2050 and to make it climate neutral by 2050. It doesn't mean that we will have no CO2 emissions or other greenhouse gas emissions, but it means that we will be emitting the greenhouse gases or CO2, but we will be able to compensate for those emissions in various carbon collection methods. So we are talking about lower CO2 levels in air or absorption of that CO2 from the atmosphere. Yes, CO2, I mean, yes, and carbon in general. When I say carbon, I mean CO2. So basically, we talk about the fact that it has to be easy to calculate. We have to also be able to make sure whether those measures are effective or not, and are they justified or not? Because this idea is physically related, totally related to the issue of our climate change, to the issue of our biodiversity, and etc. So this is highly important. Another important aspect is that carbon farming aims at rewarding the farmer or allowing the farmer to access funding so that he would be able to fund his efforts which are above his ordinary farming model. That means that he has to do something more, something additional than he does in his usual life, usual activities, and to make the level of carbon lower. Let's say, so then we can calculate the emissions of that particular farm or particular country. Now EU is only funding the process itself, for you to keep meadows and etc. But how it contributes in reality to improving our climate situation, nobody knows because nobody measures. So the idea is to finally calculate, to make those exact measures and to check those facts and figures. And as a result, the document would be issued to the farmer. It would be a valuable document issued to farmers, let's say, and those who emit too much CO2 would have to pay, let's say, more taxes, and farmers who, let's say, absorb the carbon would be rewarded for their efforts. Yes, as far as I understand, the system is similar to the others, such as pollution permits or that carbon credits. That carbon credits means that you are not allowed to emit more than you were allowed by given a quota by that permit. Am I right, Mr. Dailide? Do you agree, or it's similar? Well, I think it's not only a political motivator. There are other factors related, such as customer expectations or because, let's say, politicians would like consumers to buy products from regenerative farming, which lowers those carbon credits. That justifies the expectations of consumers. That is one aspect. Another aspect is that farmers themselves may be willing to create and develop various methods for cutting carbon. And I know there are farmers who have been doing this for 7 to 8 years and already seeing effect in terms of land fertility, in terms of use of various fertilizers and chemical substances. They are going down. And there are numerous factors related to this process. But the biggest difference between the emissions trading allowances and carbon credits, that is a voluntary market, and the rules are determined by two major agencies, the Rule Standard and Vera, and those carbon credits that are released or issued they are traded in a voluntary market, and that is the greatest difference in regulation. But is it right to say that this system is not so widespread and popular? If we speak about our regions, so it hasn't started yet, and farmers in Lithuania, well, only a few or very, very few farmers really think about implementing the system. What is worth mentioning that Donatas has touched upon, there are people who are doing that voluntarily and are developing this regenerative farming. But agriculture in general collects huge amounts of CO2 from the atmosphere, and the representatives of intense farming still demonstrate positive CO2 ratios, and they can still benefit from that. But we also see this lack of maturity of markets, and it is really difficult to trace back to those true credits. Sometimes farmers are even trying to sell those credits to several sources, and the technologies are not so widespread and popular and not easily accessible, and the market is still undereducated. Well, Mr. Juknevičius, are farmers really considering this option? Well, there are farmers who are thinking, there are farmers who are doing. So there are farmers who are really engaging these activities, or at least are trying to emit less CO2 in production of agricultural products. And they are doing that for free without any payment. It is obvious that we are talking about other active actions when farmers may be rewarded in a monetary sense. So as the chair of Lithuanian Farmers Union, I really have met farmers who have entered the system, who have joined the system, and are pioneers in Lithuania. Can you give us a specific example of some scheme or initiative? Maybe you can refer to some specific farmer. Yes, there is one farmer who took part in this scheme, and in the beginning, he was very active by thinking that he could, well, commit fully and could make his entire farm green farm. But then he realized that, he has to invest a lot, and that is not easy. That is not a very simple scheme that when you receive funding without doing anything. But we had conversations with numerous farmers, and they all observed that in the beginning they had a lot of optimism, but later then decided they would not to risk, or maybe to start with some pilot land plot, and then the main problem is that there are two systems in place in the EU, and those systems are to be recognized and certified at the EU level quite soon. So, and only then the rules of the game will be defined. So that is probably something that is discouraging farmers. So the lack of regulation in the first place, yes. And when nobody knows those rules of the game, or when the rules may be different and people don't really understand the scheme, so farmers don't really join the system. On the other hand, the system itself is rather sophisticated and complicated because there are numerous ways for accumulating carbon, and how you can measure correctly that accumulated carbon. Often farmers also find themselves in a position when they have been doing something, but the benefits were reaped by the others. So how does this happen? Can you tell us where those others come from and how they reap the benefits? The farmers don't understand the schemes completely, or what? Probably yes. First of all, we have to have a clear system. It has to be clear-cut, clearly measured, and the farmers have to be consulted and educated. Now, I believe that the system is only based on very few initiatives of the pioneers. And if we have those ambitious targets in mind, the bureaucratic mechanism is rather lengthy. So we now see that businesses are the pioneers in this area.
Yes, I also wanted to support what my colleague has said regarding the measures to lock carbon. There are many of them, and these are the differences in regard to emission allowances, which depend to the exact tons of burnt carbon. Here we're going to have a rather complex methodology, because it's about new equipment, new way of animal breeding, about changes of the animal feed. We have heard that animal breeding is a lot about methane, so something has to be changed. And things are not going to be easy. So what I want to emphasize from what we have been speaking about here is this. I like a proactive position of the state. The systems must be acknowledged on the EU level, so that a Portuguese polluter could buy a CO2 credit from a Lithuanian farmer. If it's not regulated on the EU level, then it should be somehow regulated in Lithuania, where we should have a procedure to recognize a standard, to recognize a methodology, to recognize accrediting institutions, and then we can think about market mechanisms. Well, if there is no regulation on the EU level, then why should the state take a proactive role? Mr. Janulevičius, what about industry? What lessons can agriculture learn from industry? Do you have carbon credits trade in place? Well, we don't have carbon credits. We were talking about ETS, emission allowances, emissions trading systems, and it's something specific. And credits would be granted in advance. When Lithuania assessed to the EU, part of industrial companies had to reduce their CO2 emissions. Some companies, such as fertilizer manufacturers, already reached their ceiling, and they will need carbon credits. Others managed to invest, and they have additional income from emission allowances, which they can sell in the free market. You all know that from 2014 or from 2015, when 1 ton of CO2 costs 3 euros, now it's 75, and it was 98 euros a few months ago. So this is something very specific, a very specific unit of measure. And all renewable programs are financed via this mechanism. So what I want to say, if we don't measure, then we don't know. If there is no carrot to motivate, why should people do it? So we should have a system, and we also have to have a way to reward a farmer who is working in line with the best guidances. Well, we are a member of the EU. Some of our proposals are supported in the EU, and we have to go in the same direction. Lithuania has a unique opportunity to create a larger portion of added value within the EU with our agriculture, with our energy system, and with the lowest cost. We spend a lot of money for third countries. 7 billion euros will be paid to the third countries for fossil fuels. And these funds could have been accommodated here, of course. Fertilizers would reduce the emission had we used the fertilizer produced in the EU, because we would have the most modern technology to produce them. We would also reduce farmers' CO2. We know that from 2025, subsidies and credits, which are theoretical, will be replaced by punishment. I'm talking about the transport sector. There will be no free emission allowances after 2025. We have reached the goal of 38% in reduction of CO2. We are among the leaders. Speaking of agriculture, well, we are not too good in the circular economy. In waste recycling, we are behind, with only Bulgaria and Romania being on the same level. There are a lot of unused reserves. I'm talking about food waste, which emits a lot of methanol.
28 irgi yra daug maisto yra išvaistoma. Taigi čia vėlgi
A lot of food is wasted in Europe and in Lithuania. So to come back to what I have said in the very beginning, we should go back to creating a system, measuring, having a carrot in our pocket for those who are doing well. And another thing, we should implement all of this. And just one final thought. Starting from 2026, there will be public procurement for industrial production, and the EU currently spends 13 billion for public procurement within the EU. So my vision is that any product, a bottle or a tablet or a dog food or biscuits, should be measured against the CO2 emission. 70% of the price in the tender should be self-cost, and the rest is packaging and everything that is related to CO2. And this reduction of CO2 by 30% allows a local manufacturer a bonus, to have a bonus within EU, because the local manufacturer will have advantage over third countries which use fossil fuels for the same type of production. So we do need such kind of encouragement, some kinds of carrots. We just have to implement the system. Mr. De Leader, do you have any proposals as to how to monetize this system? Well, let me go back to previous discussions. There are a lot of discussions about how local these measures are. There was a proposal by Kerry from America to finance third countries' efforts to encourage use of renewables in agriculture or production. But anyway, the decision has to be local. Carbon credits should be used and bought locally. On the other hand, there are measures on the free market where you are paid for those carbon credits and you are paid in advance. So if a farmer undertakes to implement a program, part of the credit is bought and sold to the markets right now. The market is being developed. A lot of infrastructural products are being created to assess credits and so on. The banks are setting up special departments, so the market is being developed. What we need is regulation and clear rules. If we had regulation and clear rules, everyone would feel safer on the market, and the value of a credit would increase simply for the fact of regulation. The European Commission promises to develop rules, guidelines this year, describing how the market should work in Europe. We don't expect the rules to be very strict and very defining. I'm talking about guidelines rather. Yes, so it's not the regulation that we need. No, it will be a kind of a guideline, and then it's up to the country to implement it locally. And it's up to Lithuania how we are going to regulate it. We do have some good examples, speaking about cooperation between industries and agriculture when voluntary markets and regulated markets are integrated. For example, California system, New Zealand system, a certain number of regulated credits can be bought on a voluntary market. There were 4% on California market, if I'm not mistaken, and it will be increased to 6%. So there are ways to integrate regulated and voluntary systems. But there should be more regulation anyway. Yeah, with the lack of regulation, we can brainstorm for different methods, and you have already mentioned several examples. Are there any more examples? Mr. Radzevičius, maybe you know of some countries, not necessarily within the EU, where you have seen good cross-sector cooperation in terms of credits. I have seen a very interesting initiative indeed. I saw a company in Denmark, Agro, and they have cooperation with Ukrainian farmers through a state sector. They generate those credits, and the state system helps to account for the credits and to certify and register the credits. And that's how other sectors, somewhere outside the country or outside Europe, the European Union can buy these credits. I found the practice to be rather interesting, and I'm curious about how it will be implemented in the future. What's your opinion, Mr. Janulevičius? Well, industry and food industry is an inseparable part of the system of the economy. Well, we could, of course, try to separate agriculture from industry. I feel to be quite well integrated into a food industry. This bioeconomy is something we have to develop in Lithuania. Bioeconomy includes food chains, energy, and includes packaging and sale of the final product. So I don't see too many differences here. I want to build added value in Lithuania as much as possible. We should think about the systems of encouragement. Maybe we should think about some subsidies to sell raw material to the third countries. We should encourage to create as much of the added value as possible. Maybe I will be unpopular with some of farmers who want to just have a simple way to sell their products. But together with the agricultural industry, we should try to digitalize all the chain from field to fork. It will let us have a good final product, more new jobs, and a higher GDP. Thank you, Mr. Juknevičius. What about creating more added value in agriculture? Well, farmers are businessmen. Usually they are in the lower part of the food chain, and they suffer a lot when the chain faces certain crises or disruptions. So it's the weakest part of the chain. And now they have tried to build a wall against themselves to protect themselves. So we have to knock the wall down. Some farms which are sustainable, and I'm not talking only about relation with environment, they are sustainable, they have invested into their farms. They reduce waste, they reduce CO2 emissions, they lock CO2 in the soil for many years to come. So of course, it would be very good if they were sustainable also in the sense of economy, so that they should be sustainable in economy as a reward of being sustainable in terms of environment. Processing of agricultural goods in Lithuania is good, of course, but the question is, If processed goods, or rather processed raw materials, cost the same as goods, then we have to be very patriotic. But if there are other options, then the farmer wouldn't care if his products, if his raw materials are loaded on board a ship and sent to Africa. What they want is they want to get an adequate payment for their job. Mr. Dailide, what about you? Well, the amount of subsidy is as it is, and the question is how does the final manufacturer get it? Yes, of course, as much as possible of the added value should be created in Lithuania. Processing of raw material is always good if it's done within the country. But speaking about grain, we are one of the 5 largest exporters in the EU. So we do have good examples. We do have good examples of processing. And Emelina is one of the good examples. But it's not only about farmers. It's also about the state policy and the attitude of the society. Do we want to invest into agriculture and the agricultural products? Thank you. Mr. Lapinskas, what do you think about cooperation we mentioned? Well, we are speaking in some theoretical terms. Well, Mr. Dailide did come with a practical example. From farm to fork strategy is recognized as a green one, as a strategy which can help to reduce CO2 emissions, to avoid intermediate chains, transportation through some additional warehouses or logistics centers. And it's a good strategy because it encourages a farmer to create a larger added value of a product that will be sold within the community. And then the community is being developed where local people get to know each other. But in practice, when you want to implement it and when you start talking to farmers who have great production of meat, dairy products, poultry, bakery, we face a problem. If it's a family business, they say, okay, look, I can sell my products for 2 days, and then for the rest of the week, I have to work. I have agricultural work, I have production work. I cannot be selling all the time, and I cannot hire someone to help me because I'm not sure I will be able to pay this assistant. So I think what we should start with is what help do they need? That's a question we have to ask. Say farmers need help in developing the trade. And if we can help them, it would be a great encouragement and assistance. We would have some spot sale of foodstuff, of fresh products. What do you mean by help? Who should help? And what specifically should be done? Who should help? Well, those who manage EU support to agriculture. This support is sometimes not targeted enough. And the principle itself is process-oriented rather than result-oriented. This is a question to Brussels and French farmers who support this principle. On the other hand, there is a need of targeted support, even if it's not large-scale. And these measures would help us implement the vision we're talking about.
Good idea. Mr. Janulevičius, what would you say that, that support is not always targeted and that we should support results, not the process itself? That is logical, of course. If we allocate funding, if we have a certain business plan, we need to, measure of how much the exports would grow, what profit we'll get, and etc. It doesn't matter. And I believe that, a few smaller farmers could team up, let's say in France or in Spain. They have cooperatives, so-called cooperatives. In Lithuania, that word was, ruined in a way, if I could say so. Just after the independence. But cooperative is a union, a way to have a representative for trade, and the biggest chains, trade chains, supermarket chains, they work and cooperate with those cooperatives. Cooperative is a way of shortening this supply chain and then to sell your produce directly. The speed, the freshness, and the margin could be different. As an industrialist, how do I see the future of industry, the future of Lithuania? Agriculture is a part of industry. We have a $500 million market, 500 million of people market, and I mean, including the United Kingdom. And those buyers have a good purchasing power. They are connected to the internet, and we have a producer, for instance, who is making, bottles of water, is growing carrots or something else, and he can supply his product directly, and I have this public procurement in mind, that the producer gets a better price if he meets certain requirements, and this is what we have to aim for. And thanks to some online platform, the producer is able to sell his produce anywhere in the EU. It also contributes to cutting the CO2 emissions, and I believe there are certain initiatives of how we could support this, developing these and cutting the CO2 levels and selling produce at an affordable price. Because just imagine how much CO2 is produced, let's say, in delivering product from Lithuania to Spain or vice versa. So it is the right way to do that, but it's not so easy to implement. I believe that Lithuania could be one of the pioneers where we would start to the green costs of energy, and then we could go to supplying the products. So we have some good examples, let's say, in France and in Spain. Yes, Mr. the leader. As for the support idea, we're only now speaking about financial support and subsidies, but we can also support ideas or solutions, let's say, which can give different carbon locking or carbon capture, in farms. United Kingdom is a good example. When they when they left the EU, one of the first changes that was experiments with CRISPR technology. Those are the genetically modified plants. That is a very precise technology. I'm happy that scientists from Vilnius University have contributed to the development of this technology. And now genetically modified organisms, when they are so widespread globally, we are trying to make Europe into a museum of agriculture. And that is more visible, more clearly visible now. And this industrial approach is being put aside. That is good in one way, that we can cut down the CO2 emissions through pesticides, through fertilizers. But in Lithuania, we already have a crisis with some pests who are destroying rapeseed crops. And we are not able to grow sufficient numbers of rape crop. And what could help us, that could help certain pesticides or genetically modified seeds. So I would suggest that, fewer visits to the field with fertilizers, fewer visits to the field with pesticides could cut down the levels of CO2, and that is one of the solutions. Mr. Juknevičius, you have been listening very attentively. Would you like to respond to the rapeseed crops? No, not exactly. I would like to respond to the thing that, it is very important for farmers themselves, the things that we are talking about here, even though they know too little about this system and this possibility. Because there are only a few pioneers who only have joined the system. And what I have in mind, that is a short food chain, could help us address the main problem, the climate change and global warming. And businesses who have already exhausted their possibilities of cutting the emissions, and they want to take part and to contribute, or they are forced to contribute, because otherwise they will be forced to pay money. But those businesses who haven't exhausted their opportunities, and agriculture is the business which really hasn't exhausted its opportunities, and there are huge possibilities to capture this carbon. Now we really focus a lot on sustainable farms, about organic farms. Yes. In this particular moment, in this economic crisis that we have, when we talk about the huge inflation and food inflation at the same time, I'm really worried that, those sustainable and organic farms now will be the most vulnerable, because they produce high added value products, and those products are only purchased by the people with the highest income. And if your income drops, obviously you would switch to some mass production products. So this is why I'm talking about this, that farmers are not the ones who are not interested in the spread of the system, but on the contrary, it is a possible breakthrough for them. It is a possible chance to get more funds if they improve their operations. It also goes well with the green policy. But what you are saying now, that farmers don't necessarily know enough about this. Okay, so if they don't know about this, who is supposed to tell them about it? You as the chair of the farmers union, do you talk to them about it, or do you encourage them? The question is important. Yes, you are right by saying this, that there should be a high involvement from the farmers, and that we should have some leaders who shape the policy of agriculture, who shape the entire green policy. And there are some colleagues in the audience of mine who took part in various working groups, who really were looking for various solutions to the problem. Now we are talking that EU will give some package for each country, and each country will have to adapt it to its needs. What we usually do is we are looking for examples, and we try to simply copy them in our country, of course, through our Lithuanian perspective. And I believe that my colleague will continue to what I said. Yes, I would like to raise this issue of who should do that. We heard interesting speeches in the first session during the first part. And, our achievements, our farmers' achievements in Lithuania are truly phenomenal, because we managed to achieve a huge fertility given our climatic conditions. But let's say in Denmark, they generate a higher added value. Where does it come from? The farmers' union in Denmark, I think, is a very old organization, and it is, I think, older than 100 years old. And they always had an independent consultations, independent advice to farmers. Now we don't really have that. And the problem is that all those achievements are developed by commercial structures, by a company represented by me or by Donatas, or by some huge, great individual enthusiasts. who find some niche where they can earn and make money, and this is how they develop their objectives. And they start various interesting businesses. And now we are not only focusing on the data on the institute, on the data of university, but we have established our own research center in order to make those technologies more effective, to generate more crops and to export them. We had a good school of crop engineers, who really developed the system. But we no longer have those specialists who could contribute. Okay, so we don't have this practice. Okay, Mr. Janulevičius, how do you see this from your perspective? Do we need some consultations, or who would be the ones who should tell? Well, education, I think, is always the most important factor. And as with farmers, it's also the same case. Advice and consultations and education is the most important. Farmers are very busy and people, and yes, there should be some structure which would unite them and would inform them of various novelties. If we talk about future, I still remain optimistic. As our today's topic is food for peace, peace for food. So definitely, we have some fertile lands in Lithuania. We have some good examples, and I think one day we will be able to share our knowledge and our expertise in neighboring countries, and we will be able to grow businesses in neighboring countries. What we have achieved so far in agriculture, in processing, in producing this, let's say, cereals, which cost so much more than grain itself. So we would have some knowledge and some know-how, which we believe will be able to spread and share with our neighboring countries in the future. And we have to educate farmers just like we educate people in other industries. I have a question to Mr. Lapinskas. We have reviewed the examples. Arnas, Radzevičius even mentioned the modification of genetic resources. Are there any other examples that we haven't discussed but which should be discussed of how sectors could cooperate to make carbon credits work even better? Those voluntary systems, they are at their beginning stages not only in Lithuania, but they are also at the beginning stages elsewhere too. As an industry will soon be forced to spend huge amounts of money for the search of those credits and for acquisition of those credits. And if by that time we will not be able to establish the system, we may end up with the situation which we had with waste management and packaging management a few years ago. Because we did not control the system sufficiently, we did not establish a proper system, and companies who acquired certificates, later on they had to pay again the pollution tax or the pollution fines because they were deceived, because some companies went bankrupt and did not fulfill their obligations. So the same thing applies to this principle. Okay, if it is so serious and if it costs so much and we need a clearer system and a clear regulation, what we who sit here can do to make something happen faster? Well, first of all, we had ministers. Now we no longer have them in the audience. When I asked the Minister of Environment, will you take part in drafting the documents and standards for the system, they said no. Do you stand next to their door and do you knock them on the door? Yes, I said, yes, we have a question that is very important and we need to resolve it. We need to regulate this area. And they said, no, we are waiting for the EU and they will say something a year or 2 years later. And only then we will start joining the system, let's say in 2026, when we will be lagging behind. I totally agree with what the farmers' organizations say. They are doing something already. They are exploring it, and they will be prepared to start it, to implement it in reality when the time comes. So now the responsible authorities and responsible institutions, they have to be told that you have to do this. You cannot stay away from this. You have to admit these problems, recognize them, and regulate them. Of course, we can have a voluntary system, but voluntary system only fits for green brainwashing and very initial projects. But when we'll start talking about billions of payments, then we need to regulate it toughly. Mr. Janulevičius, what could you contribute? We and the Institute of Green Economy, I think we have been cooperating with the Green Policy, Institute for a long time. So first of all, yes, we need to educate our people. We have to read the documents that are being drafted, and we have to see, we have to plan and forecast and foresee the future. We have to plan some 5 years ahead. Otherwise, we'll be stuck. We, I think, should draw certain resolutions, and we should send those resolutions to the institutions who are in charge. Otherwise, we will not achieve anything. You know, it's not only about using the possibilities that the EU gives. We have a great opportunity now to do, but we have to make it in a targeted manner and without distorting the market. Mr. The Leader, do you have an advice to the others? Mr. Lapinskas had provided a good example because you are the one who is doing something. Well, you know, I'm not a politician. I come from business area. I talk to companies and we just start doing, you know, by what possibilities we have. Currently, there's no regulation, so yes, we have joined this system voluntarily. We have analyzed the methodology of what can be done, of how it can be sold, those credits that have been generated, and it seems to be working. I believe that those methodologies, the regulation methodologies, will not be very different from voluntary system that we have in place now, because these are the standards regulated by certain institutions. Anyone who starts doing this now will have certain experience and will generate certain benefits to the society, to the environment, and will already have some experience, because those methods, regulated methods, I don't believe they will be very different. There may be slight differences, but they will still form the basis for future regulation. Why this voluntary market works? Because some companies already acquire and purchase those credits, and even the larger companies, they're already calculating, they're carrying out audits, and they already recognize those. So the infrastructure is being built, is being developed. And I think we can already, we already have the basis to start building it on. As Industrialists Confederation, together with bioeconomics institutions and other stakeholders, we have a research institute which assists the industry in selling those trade allowances, carbon trade allowances. And we are building a platform which will be suitable for use in the future, because there's now not really a great difference whether you build a platform for carbon trade allowances or if you build a platform for these carbon credits. So, the principle will be the same. The Industrialist Confederation and this digital innovation center that we already have, we buy and sell those permits. And I believe that agriculture could really join this initiative too and could save in the future. I see that we have many questions, and we also have people in the audience who are willing to ask. So could you please introduce yourself and ask the question? Unfortunately, interpreters cannot hear the question. You need to use the microphone. Vice Chairman and also the pig breeders, representative of pig breeders organization. From the debate, I got the impression that the problem is highly complicated, but it is not as complicated as you are saying. There are few sources of those greenhouse gas emissions, that is methane produced by animals, and fertilizers that, well, those two sources of carbon. And if we focus on these two sources, so I see a lot of chaos in biogas sector. Because during the past funding period, Lithuania only allocated funding for small companies, and other projects were not funded, were not eligible. We are talking about some complex, huge problems, but we are not able to resolve very simple problems. You know, if we have a source of pollution, then we have to resolve this problem in the very place where this pollution comes from. I'm not saying that we have to cut the fertilizers. No, fertilizers. Farmers now use fewer fertilizers, less fertilizers, because they do not have enough funds, and they are trying to save. This is how they cut the levels of CO2 at the same time. And if they were provided credits, carbon credits on top of this, so everyone would benefit. And what is the starting level? Where do we start to measure? You know, what is the benchmark? So you are saying that the problem is so much easier, and we can resolve it in a simple way. And the pesticides is a totally different topic. No, pesticides are not a different topic in my view, because nowadays the differences between pesticides are huge. Some pesticides are very harmful to the environment, and they are very expensive to produce in terms of carbon. Others pesticides are very innovative and environment friendly, and their production costs less. That is important to note. As for fertilizers, we don't have a base now, a starting point, and now we often say that we support all the green ideas or the Green Deal, but we don't really understand what is the composition of our soil. And we see that we have very low levels of phosphorus, let's say. And if we start developing the land, and if we start cultivating the land in those areas with low phosphorus, we will trap ourselves. As for nitrogen fertilizers, it is a fluid and volatile substance. It has to be fertilized every spring or added to the soil every spring. So you need special fertilizer sprinklers to spread the fertilizers. So I heard the question today, or a statement, I'm sorry, that large farms in the regions are not the ones that we should be focusing on. We should be focusing on the smaller farms. Yes, you may be right, but those smaller farms should also have those sprinklers or so special equipment to spread the fertilizers and to cut the levels of fertilizers. And I see huge threats in this coming. You wanted to add something. Well, I think that, the small farms which are not able to acquire certain equipment or technology, I think they should team up and form those so-called cooperatives, and there are many ways to address this problem. This has been mentioned before. As for points of pollution or sources of pollution, just like you mentioned, yes, that problem was right that you have mentioned, but we have numerous other problems. We can lock, let's say, carbon in soil, which are not so usual for us, such as protecting the wetlands and etc. As for the basic level, yes, we will have to define certain basic level, but without the calculation system, without the accounting system, there's no point in setting this base level. If, let's say, we have now a system for fertilizer tracking and tracing, from every field, from the producer to the field and etc. And I'm told that, we don't have enough political will to implement this. But let's say when I see the statistics of fertilizers used in Lithuania, we see the deviation up to 30%. So, what kind of base level are we talking about? So, we have to regulate it in a tough manner, and we have to enter the right data in the first place.
Let's go back to the topic. Instead of providing an explanation to the listeners, we have gone into something else. I just wanted to go back to my colleague's question. What are we talking about? We are talking about farmers and farms, and if they emit less carbon than they lock, this is the turning point. This is what we're talking about. And how should we get to this point? There are different options. I just want to say one sentence. We have to understand that we must use the CO2 tax in order not to see the description in our local industry. Yes, the fertilizer which we import is cheaper, and fertilizer accounting is very straightforward. Okay, I understand. You say that we have to be very strict about the amounts of fertilizer which is imported. We have to know the amounts, right? Well, use of fertilizer is not the most important factor. Let me give you an example. When we count the emission from nitrogen fertilizer, the nitrogen factor is very important. When fertilizer absorption is 2-3 times higher as compared to regular technology, nitrogen absorption factor is threefold less. So we emit 30% less of nitrogen suboxide because we multiply it by 300 in order to convert to CO2. That's why we're talking about huge emissions from the soil. So the accounting itself with no methodology bears no value, because then the farm which uses fertilizer scarcely, we account them in the general statistics. We lock a lot of carbon in the product, and no one assesses this factor. Yes, farmers are 10% of our society, and the rest of CO2 is unlocked not by farmers, but by whom? By you, by the users. And we don't take this into account. When we speak about implying taxes to CO2, we should ask who is unlocking CO2. Okay, I got your question. Is anyone here ready to answer? Because we have only 5 minutes and more instrumental questions to discuss. I understand that all the topics are related and very important, but we have to narrow down. Yes, it's important. I mean, the absorption, and there should be some accounting, and the accounting has to be precise, otherwise it will turn into statistics. Now we are going to have lunch, and you will be able to meet and discuss. This is what the forum is about. The aim of our panel is also to provide some instrumental approaches. We spoke about cooperation. We spoke about some shortages in regulation in the system itself. One of the readers is asking, what is one of the most important disadvantage of carbon farming in Lithuania? Lack of knowledge, lack of regulation, financial aspect. What else? I think we spoke about everything except for the financial aspect. Yes. The financial aspect is important as compared to ETL. This is due because of the weak and episodic markets. They are fragmented and they have to be developed. Will there be CO2 accumulating, credit accumulating proposals on the national level? Will it be on the EU level? It's a technical question of a logistical character. Probably nobody can answer it now. We should move from voluntary to a regulated market. Cooperation, cooperatives can help solve all the problems. So we're talking about the cooperatives here again. Okay, let me go back to more specific questions. Well, it's an ironic. So if you want to pollute, all you need is money and cheap credits. It's a rhetoric question. Very many companies provide different models based on sustainable farming. Who is regulating the models and the farmers? Say there is a person, a farmer, who wants to implement one or another model. Where he should look for such a model? How should he choose it? What can we advise to such a person? Well, you need to look at what standard is implemented and what are the companies who have already implemented it. And I have a short remark. You know, when you said you can pollute if you have money, it's a very serious question. You know, in Poland, they adopted a law which stipulated the use of a larger share of a biomass in a fossil fuel boiler houses, which means that they could replace cheap carbon credits, only pay €5, buy some kind of credit, and then continue pollute with fossil fuels. Did they know this in the beginning? Were they aware? No, they started to buy the granulars in Lithuania and in Poland, and then they thought, why should we do it? Why should we bother? If a ton of CO2 credit is €5, why should we bother? We have some time for the last question. If there is no question, let me just make some conclusions. Any questions? Mr. Juknevičius. I volunteered. I wanted to finish off this panel by saying that there is no gap between a citizen, a user, a state, and authorities. Everything is interconnected. If there was no expectation from the users, from the customers, there would be no green course.
Nes mes esam,
There would be no Green Deal. And we, coming from business, cannot just witness what is happening. We have to move on too. So our businesses are pioneers, and we just hope that the process will go on. We just need to be more active participators in the process. It's not the first time I'm discussing on this, and I have never heard such a large, I have never seen such a large audience. It's an example illustrating that this topic is becoming more and more relevant and interesting. Let's hope that next year we will move on to the largest hall. Okay, thank you very much. Vidmantas Janulevičius, Arnas Radzevičius, Donatas Dailydė, Raimundas Juknevičius, and Remigijus Lapinskas, and now enjoy your lunch. Thank you.